Well, again, very happy to be here. My talk is going to be on a number of time scales, starting from all the way back to Darwin's Origin of Species. Also, the span of my career, which is now 50 years. Then concentrating on the integration of CBS and EvoSci, which actually began with that conference in Parma that you just mentioned. So that's about 15 years ago. And then, of course, concentrating on the present and the near future. And these timescales are on my mind because recently I created a comprehensive online archive of my work, all of my academic publications and online work. This is not a vanity project. What began as the about section of the website turned into a short memoir. My whole reason for doing it, and the reason for anyone to become interested, is that it's all about not me, but this theory that has richly informed my life. So I say, if anyone qualifies as a polymath, it is me. This is due to one primary reason. My work is richly informed by evolution. My personal attributes are secondary to this primary reason. And I structure the memoir as a number of becomings. As a biologist, I have studied many different organisms and topics. That's the whole point. That's the power of evolutionary theory, to provide a passport to all subjects. And then I was lucky to be present at a time in history when this amazing theory expanded to include all things human. And so I became a philosopher, a human behavioral scientist, so on and so forth. And because this is due to the theory, it is something that everybody can do to a degree. So if you go back to the beginning and we see Darwin with this amazing theory, and at the end of the Origin of Species, he concluded there is grandeur in this view of life. Basically meaning that this view of life makes sense of everything about the living world. And Thomas Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, was reputed to have said, upon encountering the theory of natural selection, "How stupid of me not to have thought of that." It's that simple in retrospect. And then fast forwarding to the 1970s, we have the quote that everyone loves to quote, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution," by the geneticist Theodosis Dobzhansky. All of these celebrating the amazing explanatory scope of evolutionary theory. And so that's when I was lucky, a period of history that I was lucky to enter. I write that in 1973, that's when I was a graduate student, the most exciting articles published in the academic journals were by authors who first framed a hypothesis informed by evolutionary theory, and then proceeded to test the hypothesis with a well-chosen organism or habitat that was not necessarily their previous specialty. To be merely a taxonomic or habitat expert had become passé by comparison. And yet, the modern synthesis, as it was called, could also be called the Great Constriction, because even though Darwin framed his theory in terms of this triad of variation, selection, and replication, and no matter what the mechanism of replication, with the advent of genetics, the study of evolution became largely restricted to genetic evolution. And so the study of other Darwinian processes, what B.F. Skinner called selection by consequences, was relegated to other disciplines. And I think that this is increasingly becoming apparent that for all that happened during the 20th century, in many respects, it was a constriction of evolutionary thought. And so you've already heard about the archipelago of knowledge and practice, many islands of thought, which with little communication among islands. I actually think it's fascinating to treat this not as a metaphor, but as an analogy, that just as with biological evolution, when you get isolation, then you get this special kind of of diversity. The same is true for cultural evolution. And so whenever a group of people become isolated in their thought and practice, their ideas will diverge to an extent and become incomprehensible to the other islands. And we see this in the behavior of our own field of psychology and both basic and applied psychology. A lot of you are familiar with basically behaviorism was once the dominant tradition in academic psychology, but then for some reason it got displaced by this other tradition called the cognitive revolution. Then something else came into view called evolutionary psychology, which was actually gene-based, very heavily gene-centric in its own right. All of you know there's hundreds of therapeutic methods, and along the way, a segregation of basic and applied science. This graphic here is by someone named Donald Stokes. He has practical applications on the x-axis, foundational research on the y-axis, and it defines a number of quadrants. There's pure foundational research, which he names after the theoretical physicist Niels Bohr. There's pure practical application, which he names after Thomas Edison. And then in the top right corner, there's both. He calls this use-inspired basic research, and he names it in honor of Louis Pasteur, who both cured diseases and made fundamental contributions to microbiology. And so we want to occupy the Pasteur quadrant, but really what's happened and what needs to be addressed is the segregation into the Bohr quadrant or the Edison quadrant. So this is a very important objective for all of us. Also, we need to be mindful of individualism as a dominant intellectual tradition that, of course, has deep roots, but has been dominant for the last 70 years and is exemplified by Margaret Thatcher's famous quip, "There is no such thing as societies, only individual men and women and families." And so this tradition still dominates economics, has dominated the social sciences, and my own field of evolutionary science during its selfish genes days, which is when I basically entered the field, as if everything that evolves has to be explained as maximizing the fitness of individuals and their genes. And it is very present in clinical science, where the individual is almost always the unit of therapy and training, extending only to couples and families. And so individualism is something that I think pervades our own discipline, contextual behavioral science, in addition to just about everything else. Well, thankfully, there was a turning point, and that's what I was privileged to play a role in. Starting in the 1970s, scientists started to go back to basics and define Darwinian evolution as any process that combines the three ingredients of variation, selection, and replication, no matter what the mechanism. And this book is familiar to many of you. Eva DeBlanco was a plenary speaker at ACBS WorldCon some years ago. And so other Darwinian processes include genetics, of course, epigenetics, changes in gene expression rather than gene frequency, forms of social learning found in many species, and symbolic thought, which is distinctively, perhaps even uniquely human. And here we have a wonderful connection between evolutionary science and contextual behavioral science in the form of relational frame theory. This is actually a connection which we need to actually make more progress in that particular integration. Also, Darwinian evolution can be an intra-generational process in addition to an intergenerational process. We know that this is true for the adaptive component of the immune system, where it's been worked out in incredible detail. And I'm thinking of our behavioral system as like the immune system, with both an innate and adaptive component. I only got a glimpse of the previous talk, but I think we were actually getting a glimpse of the innate component of the adaptive immune system, something incredibly complex that we're born with and does not change during our lifetimes. And then there's the adaptive component, the variation and selection of antibodies in the case of the immune system, but the variation and selection of behaviors in the case of awkward conditioning, and also in the case of symbolic thought. And so B.F. Skinner got a lot right, he got a lot wrong, but his concept of selection by consequences as something that applies to the open-ended capacity for change in individuals, cultures, as like genetic evolution was a priceless insight, and one that we need to build upon. And then there's multi-level selection, which is what I'm best known for. And I sometimes describe it as like a perverse alchemist that turns gold into lead. This idea that adaptation at one level becomes disruptive at higher levels. So with Edward O. Wilson, I'm known for the meme, selfishness beats altruism within groups, altruistic groups beat selfish groups, everything else is commentary. And we can extend that to multiple scales. So self-interest, a great thing until it leads to self-dealing. Helping family, helping friends, a great thing until it leads to nepotism and cronyism. My nation first, great until it leads to international discord. Growing the economy, great until it leads to overheating the earth. And so the message, which is very, very simple, to think that it was rejected so thoroughly in the middle of the 20th century is amazing in retrospect, is that adaptation at any level requires a process of selection at that level and tends to be undermined by selection at lower levels. And so this is finally becoming so clear and so important for policy in all of its forms that it's becoming known as the multi-level paradigm as a true alternative to individualism. And so this is what it means to complete the Darwinian revolution, the subtitle of one of my books, that we can think about everything we associate with humanity, culture, and policy, in addition to biology, as within the explanatory scope of this Darwinian triad of variation, selection, and replication. And happy to report that this is present tense, already in progress, not just in the future, but it needs to become both conscious and catalyzed. So let's just spend a little bit of time on these key words. A conscious evolution. Here we have a real handicap, a legacy of the Great Constriction, was to insist in very strong terms that evolution has no purpose. Organisms just vary. It's only the immediate environment that does the selection. And in retrospect, this makes sense only in the narrowest of contexts. And what we need to determine, to establish basically, is that all forms of positive change efforts, therapy, training, policy, in all of its forms, must be conscious. And of course, we already used the word mindful about all three ingredients of Darwinian evolution. And if you think of the three ingredients, then it's easy to see how each one of them can become mindful or conscious. In other words, we need to mindfully determine the target of selection. What are we trying to do that to reach our valued goals? And then we must consciously orient variation around the target. Look for different solutions to the problem. Look at natural variation. Create our own more intentional variation. And then when we find something that works better, then we have to identify it and replicate it, realizing that it will be sensitive to context. And of course, you don't need to be told context is everything. That's what contextual behavioral science means. And it's what makes such a perfect match with evolutionary science, because evolutionary science is always also about context. And if we're not conscious about these things, evolution will still take place, but will result in problems rather than solutions. That's the whole message of multi-level selection. It's so often it results in outcomes that benefits me, not you, us, not them, or short-term, not long-term. And so evolution must be conscious in each of the three ingredients. That's what has to become basically the accepted common common knowledge, to completely remove the stigma that evolution cannot be a conscious process. Well, I love the concept of catalysis and building upon what we know it means in chemistry. In chemistry, a catalytic molecule is something that grabs on to other molecules, holds them in a way that binds them to each other, and then it's released to repeat the process. Catalysis can increase the rate of a reaction by many orders of magnitude. And that's what we're seeing here in this demonstration called elephant toothpaste. Please visit, type in elephant toothpaste on the web to see other examples. I was recently doing that, and I came upon a video of the Guinness Book of World Records for elephant toothpaste, which took place in a swimming pool. So check out my Twitter account for a link to that video. And it's so evocative to think that this is also true of rates of cultural change, and that if we do things right, then we could actually cause positive change to take place in years rather than decades or not at all. We can do the equivalent of this with cultural evolution. I find it so empowering to keep that in mind. And it's not just inspirational, it's something that can actually happen. And in a way, is taking place at this moment as we speak with a conference such as this, which is very much getting people together and hooking them up in a way that binds to each other in a way that would have been much slower or not having happened at all otherwise. So this brings us to the integration of CBS and evolutionary science. In my personal life, it began in 2009, starting with Tony Biglin, who is known to many of you. He's the one who introduced me to Steve Hayes and Dennis Embry. That conference in Parma was the first one that I attended. Our first big product was a target article in BBS titled "Evolving the Future Towards the Science of Intentional Change." It's there that we talk about the archipelago. And ACBS members became integral in the development of Pro-Social World, especially Paul Atkins, who is an ACBS fellow, longtime member from Australia, and is a co-founder of our current organization, Pro-Social World. And so these two books are two products of our collaboration together. And so what is the added value of this particular collaboration between ACBS and what's now Pro-Social World? One is to return contextual behavioral science to its evolutionary roots. It has deep evolutionary roots in pragmatism. But this is basically, it became divorced from those roots. And Steve has said that the first time we met in Tony Biglin's home, he broke into tears because it was the first time that he and everything that he represented was being taken seriously by an evolutionary biologist. That's how bad things had become with the segregation, basically, with the contextual behavioral science being segregated into the applied sciences and not really being taken noticed at all by the so-called basic sciences. So that's the second added value, is returning CBS to the Pasteur quadrant. That at the same time we're doing our wonderful practical work, we are also addressing the deepest questions that could be asked about the nature of life, the nature of humanity, the nature of culture, the nature of moral systems, the nature of knowledge. These are all things that we can be doing at the same time that we're actually working towards positive change. And one of Steve's of these initiatives is reflected not just in ACBS, but in a special issue of the Clinical Psychology Review on clinical psychology from an applied evolutionary perspective. Another added value is to become multi-level, because as I've already said, although ACBS does do some things at the group level, primarily it's at the individual level. And multi-level selection theory basically adds a whole dimension that what we're doing so well at the individual level can also be performed on groups and groups of groups and processes of all kinds. And also the recognition that the small group is a fundamental unit, not the individual, but the small and appropriately structured group is a fundamental unit of human society. And that the best thing that we can do for individuals is to embed them in small and appropriately structured groups. And appropriate structure is key because small groups are vulnerable to all of the disruptive forces of lower level selection. That goes for couples and even goes for individuals when you want to think of individuals as groups in some senses, which is one of the important concepts that's being developed. And so the core design principles of Elinor Ostrom are key here. I'm not going to go through them in detail because I think actually they've become quite familiar to the society, which is a sign of progress. And my article with Jim Cohen on groups as organisms, implications for therapy and training, is our contribution to that special issue of Clinical Psychology Review, which I really recommend to everyone that develops that concept. And so we have this single toolkit that can be applied across all contexts. That's another added value, that there's just no topic area where these tools don't apply. It all boils down to the common denominators of cooperation and adaptability. So that's a fulfillment of the explanatory scope of evolutionary theory. So now what's the added value of ACBS for a pro-social world? It started as a project within my previous nonprofit, the Evolution Institute, around 2009. And then it spun off to become an independent nonprofit in 2020 with Paul Atkins as my co-founder. And throughout this period, ACBS has been hands down the single most important organization for developing pro-social world throughout its histories. And there's a list of some of our co-founders. So I'm so grateful to all of these and more for their interest and their contribution in developing our mission of consciously evolving a world that works for all. And the way we put it is that we're kind of building a kind of a temple. Its foundation is evolutionary theory. It has two pillars. One pillar is contextual behavioral science. The other pillar is the Ostrom core design principles. And based on that, then we're in a position to consciously evolve a world that works for all. That's how we think of them, as two pillars standing upon evolutionary theory. And so we describe pro-social world as, in the first place, an overarching evolutionary worldview. And the more I do this kind of work, the more I realized how essential that is, basically, to just see the world the right way. Much to be said on our meaning systems as the cultural equivalent of our genes. Every meaning system has a limited repertoire of flexibility, behavior, but to go beyond that, you must change your meaning system. So in some ways, that's the most important. Then the practical toolkit, of course. We built up a facilitator community, over 700 individuals in over 30 nations, a scientific research community for occupying the Pasteur quadrant, not only our own research program, but also to serve as an international hub, an expanding ecosystem of partners, and all of this being supported by a wonderful new grant from the John Templeton Foundation, which has basically enabled us to do this at a much greater level than we were before. Okay, so now I'm at the final part of my talk as to what we can actually do now in the present and future. And a lot of this work is done for me by the report of the ACBS task force, which was published only last year, on the future of ACBS by Steve and many others. And I wrote a commentary to that article. Oh, first, a quote from that article. That's a little bit of as obscured by my menu bar up here, but basically a dimensional and multi-level extended evolutionary approach. Adopting such an approach fosters consilience with other perspectives by placing CBS work underneath the umbrella of one of the most integrative and centrally important, functionally and contextually oriented theories in all of the life sciences. evolutionary theory. So that is quite a mouthful. There's academic language for you. But what it shows is how much ACBS has taken on evolutionary science, how much has been accomplished during the last 15 years. And I think that that's something that really needs to be celebrated. That's catalysis for you. If this didn't go on, all kinds of things would not have happened that actually have happened. And in my commentary, I make 5 recommendations, which is going to end this talk. First of all, we need to go beyond laissez-faire science, in which we basically operate separately as opposed in a coordinated fashion. Let's implement our research agenda within our own society. Wouldn't that be interesting? Developing the concept of sprint groups, which I'll look forward to elaborating on. And then maybe most important, cooperating with pro-social world in the creation and development of field sites where the actual positive change effort takes place. And then finally, taking participatory action research seriously. So I'm going to spend just about 1 minute on each of these, and then I look forward to a Q&A and, of course, our panel discussion. Well, one thing multi-level selection theory tells us is that the metaphor of the invisible hand is profoundly untrue. It is simply not the case that lower level units pursuing their separate interests self-organize to benefit the common good. That means system level adaptation requires system level selection. We have to have the whole system as our target of selection. Everything underneath that needs to be coordinated. This has become an essential insight for rethinking economics, and much of what I do is in the economic sphere, where we call this the multi-level paradigm as a replacement of neoclassical economics. But I think it's also needed for the implementation of the ACBS task force recommendations. If we simply had people reading the task force article and then separately implementing it in ways that they saw fit, then that would not have the sufficient coordination in order to have a system level effort. And so I think somehow the society has to get together after the publication of that article and then have a dialogue, or what can we do as a society to implement this? I think it's over 30 recommendations, rather than leaving that ad hoc to its members. And so we have to take the message of multi-level selection seriously for the ACBS agenda. And while we're doing that, let's use it for our own society, using itself as a unit of selection. ACBS is a very large organization. I believe it surpassed 10,000 members, international, of course, and I'm speaking to one of its chapters. It has just loads and loads of groups, its committees, its SIGs, geographical chapters, all provide an opportunity to catalyze cultural evolution within our own our ranks. And so I think nobody's going to be as committed to developing our methodology as ourselves. And as some of you know, Steve Hayes has a new crusade, basically, which is to recognize individuals as their own complex dynamical systems, which means that just much of standard statistics violates the ergodic theorem. And so what we need to do is we need to gather a lot of time series data on individuals and then go to the group level above that. And so Steve, that's something that Steve is pioneering, an idionomic approach. And it's something that we can employ in our own groups as we attempt to build the society. That's just one example of how we could eat our own dog food, as my friend and associate Jeff Denung likes to say. So let's experiment with our own society as we're also working with other organizations. And so the concept of sprint groups, most organizations are designed to persist indefinitely, such as ACBS, or any business. But they also make use of small teams designed to accomplish specific objectives over a period of time. I like to call these sprint groups, but many versions have risen in the Ivory Archipelago, especially business, where we have such things as lean, agile, Amazon.com's 2 pizza teams, a wonderful method called rapid results. A great example of how these basically convergent cultural evolution in the archipelago of knowledge. And so these have arisen all the time. But a key insight is that our toolkit, the core design principles, the ACT matrix, goal setting, and so on, can be applied at the level of sprint groups in addition to the level of larger organizations. And so we can develop our own team-based approach, and these can become research units in addition to work units. I find this especially exciting because sprint groups, by their nature, are small. They have a duration. We can have hundreds of them. And so when it comes time to really good experimental design, of course, we can do that with ongoing groups, but we can do it even better with sprint groups. And so developing a technology and a kind of a digital framework for sprint groups is a very important objective. And all of us can be using sprint groups whenever what we're doing can be done in small and appropriately structured groups. And here's an example that is kind of amusing in a way that of us forming a sprint group. So there's a SIG for EvoSci, and even though ACBS is evolutionizing as a whole society, when the SIG met at the online WorldCon, I think it was in 2021, we started to say, wait a minute, what's going on here? The society is evolutionizing, but the SIG is not doing anything. In fact, the SIG is moribund. We weren't doing anything. And so I suggested, let's do a sprint group. Let's who wants to get together and work over a period of eight weeks in order to determine what our SIG can do in order to catalyze the integration of EvoSci and ACBS. And so at that suggestion, about 24 people said, great idea, let's do it. And we all committed to work for 8 weeks. We'd meet weekly, we'd spend an hour between meetings, so on and so forth. And this group came to life. It was a wonderful experience. And then we developed plans for expanding to the level of the whole SIG, and then for this whole SIG to work with ACBS. At that point, it lapsed back into inactivity. And the reason was very simply that when we tried to communicate with the whole SIG, then through the ACBS website, then that proved more difficult. If you just post an email, we know that the response rate is very low and so on. And at that point, we all got distracted by other things. And the SIG group went away as fast as it came into being. But it's a wonderful illustration and proof of concept. And Pro-Social World is developing on its own the concept of sprint groups. And so I'd really like to reintroduce it to ACBS. And I think that with just a little more work, it can become a very important part of ACBS. Now next, the idea of course, working in the field. At the end of the day, we want to be working in real world situations, working with communities and people to steward their cultural evolution. And one of the things that we've developed, which has proven to be an innovation in its own right, is a multi-level framework for ongoing interactions. The first time was in a UK project, which I'll mention in a minute, and we're continuing to use it. So individuals, level 1, are members of small teams, level 2, representing organizations, level 3, that expect to work with each other, level 4. And so this is ongoing interactions. Cultural evolution is an ongoing process. And it turns out that this structure is very useful in its own right, even before we talk about what gets said and the level of instruction that takes place, because it just allows interactions to take place at these 4 levels on an ongoing basis And when it's done right, it's sufficiently enjoyable and productive and fulfilling that nobody wants it to end. It's enjoyable. It's useful for them. It's how things are getting done. It's how new opportunities are unfolding. And so this is really the beginning of establishing multi-level selection, a framework for multi-level selection in the real world. We did this first in our UK project, and ACBS was one of the teams, and it's led to ongoing projects in Bristol in the school system, Scottish National Health Service with Jim Lemon, and more. Then we employed it in Latin America, which is in its first year, started with 8 organizations, very diverse contexts, and so this illustrates the idea of the common language. These are organizations that otherwise wouldn't see any reasons to interact with each other because they have different missions, but now they do because they see everything in the context of cooperation and coordination. This is one of our Brazilian partners, Collab Soul. And so Brazil is one focus for this. Brazil also has a ACBS chapter, which, if I understand correctly, is over 300 members. And so imagine the Brazilian chapter of ACBS becoming involved in this effort. How catalytic would that be? And that's true for all geographical chapters, of course, including the Polish chapter. So whenever any one of us forms a field site, and we're working with people in real world settings, we should be getting together and combining the resources of ACBS and pro-social world. And it provides a wonderful context for local interactions for the local chapters to be doing things in addition to the international society level. Now, finally, the core design principles are inherently participatory, done with, not done to. And although I'm sure that just about everyone here agrees with that sentiment in principles, I think it does pose challenges for the research focus of ACBS. And one of ACBS's greatest assets is its strong research focus. I'm just so envious every time I go on to the page of the ACBS website listing all the randomized control trials supporting ACT, now nearing 1,000. So that's just great. But on the other hand, there's something about that kind of science which is very top down and tends not to be participatory. And so I think we need to do that kind of science, but we also need to realize that in many, many cases, it's not appropriate. Often we're working in cases with very small sample sizes, very small numbers of groups, and we need to do an expansion of research methods that meets our partners where they're currently at and develops the capacity for research and assessment over time. And so I think that ACBS is going to have a learning curve to climb to become fully participatory. And we can all look forward to that. First of all, acknowledge it, be mindful of it, and then to work on an expanded expansion of research methods. So I want to end just with a shout out for 2 Polish connections. So one is Diana Singh's work, working with pro-social schools and youth. Peter Bullock, who's participating remotely, and hello to Dustin Erdosh and Susan Hanisch, part of our pro-social schools and youth. So happy that you're there in person. And so this is something which is taking place, one of these field sites that I've been talking about. And I also want to mention this person, Nina Vidacek, who is a Polish expatriate. She now lives in Norway and has become one of the best known public intellectuals in Norway. We've been working with her for a long time on Norway as a case study of cultural evolution at the national scale. So this book, Sustainable Modernity, the Nordic Model and Beyond, is one outcome of that. One of the first from a multi-level evolutionary perspective. Chapter 1 is by me and the Norwegian evolutionist Dag Hessen. And then another one of Nina's book is called The Origins of Anti-Authoritarianism. And the thesis of this book is basically, when you look at anti-authoritarian movements, they have the small group dynamic of Eleanor Ostrom's core design principles. And so she actually brings the CDP approach to bear on anti-authoritarianism movements, drawing upon her own experience as a young woman with the Solidarity movement in Poland. And so that's, I think, fascinating for two reasons. First of all, it's subject matter, and also because we're working with Nina, and Nina is also still has a strong Polish connection. So I think that there's another case of context independence that we could make all of these connections. So with that, I believe I am done. And so thank you very much for your attention. I hope you've enjoyed this reflection on multiple timescales. And now I look forward to our Q&A and panel discussion.